Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream that I think you're really going to enjoy. Now, we've been working hard on this for a while, but we are finally at our fifth and final episode going through Aleksandr Dugin's fourth political theory. We've kind of moved through each chapter, each section of the book here, outlining the different theories that Dugin is expounding, his ideas, where he's going with this fourth political theory, what those things mean. And today we're going to be taking a look at the last two chapters, along with two appendices, which I think are interesting. They introduce some interesting ideas as well. And as always, helping me unravel the mystery of Dugin is Michael Millerman. Michael, thanks for coming on.
Good to be with you.
Absolutely. So let's just go ahead and jump in on chapter 13 here. Now, chapter 13 is about gender in the fourth political theory. And this is another one where I'm a little doubtful on some of the things that Dugin asserts. I think he gets a little kind of tricky with his language, or doesn't say some things with his language, though he is also, again, of course, looking at Dasein here. And this is a concept I'm not as familiar with. I haven't read my Heidegger yet, so there might be some insights here that you can unlock for us as we get started. But he talks about early on the gender of politics, how in other political theories, the modern political theories, the dominant gender is male. And for anyone to really participate in politics, to be a person in the political sense, one must be male. And so, even in these different political theories that might challenge the supremacy of males in politics or patriarchy or these kind of things, the only thing they end up doing is trying to shift women into the male role to make them fully human by making them more male. Do you want to expound a little bit on kind of his understanding of the kind of the political gender as male?
Sure. So you could say his question is kind of like this. Each political theory has its own understanding of what the genders should be. So he does distinguish at first between biological sex and sociological gender. So we're in the realm here of the political standards, ideals, or conceptions. And he does say that according to the classical liberal conception, it's the wealthy, urban, white, rational male. And that you could imagine a situation where, for example, for the sake of equality, you don't try to make women more like that standard. Rather, you try to make men more like a female standard, for example. That would be another way of equalizing the sexes. So in his analysis, he shows the typical model of the liberal man and woman, the typical model under the communist ideology, and the typical models under the fascist ideology. And I think if we ask ourselves, doesn't your conception of the classically liberal man, the communist man, and the fascist man, they give you different pictures? And the classically liberal woman and the communist woman, the fascist woman, they would probably also give you different pictures. So that's what he's interested in assessing, how the gender roles differ in those different models. And obviously, because he's rejecting all three of them, he has to think about what an alternative might look like.
Right. And so, in the kind of the liberal sense, he says that liberalism accepts kind of the urban white male as the core political actor. In the Marxism, it attempts to kind of destroy this idea of gender, but ends up failing in practice. And then in fascism, it actually exalts the white male, the urban white male, beyond the just the actor to kind of the ideal.
Yeah, he says the third political theory, it intensifies some of those attributes. So no
Mm-hmm.
longer just the white male, but the Nordic white male, no longer just rationality, but hyper rationality, super rationality, or the image of the Superman, not just a man of action, but the man of the will to power. So that kind of carries forward some of the tendencies of the liberal model, but just sort of to a higher degree or to a more intense extent. And one place to look for some of these figures, would be in like propaganda posters. You could consider Soviet propaganda posters or communist propaganda posters, and you'll see there that even though there's some attempt to undermine the classically liberal roles, still you have this sort of hardworking soldier-like masculine figure, and in some cases the women presented with the same sort of features. So he's looking towards all of that. And one helpful thing I want to mention on the communist side of the equation This I always found was very profound and insightful. So Leo Strauss, and by the way, my view is when we're studying Dugin, it's helpful, as you know, from our previous conversations, in my view and your view, any support we can get from other thinkers besides Dugin in understanding what he's saying is only to our benefit. So Strauss one time was lecturing on Marx, and he said that in Marx, the source of the division of labor, so the division of labor is an obstacle to a social equality. And the source of the division of labor is the division into the sexes, or basically the division between men and women. So if you want to overcome the division of labor, you have to overcome the division between the sexes, which already tells you that in Marxist ideology, broadly speaking, there's a kind of orientation towards overcoming that bifurcation and towards overcoming the firmly rooted roles of men and women, which would be very different from the fascist or the liberal models. So yes, he also says, fascism has introduced into post-liberal or postmodern interpretations of gender some like BDSM elements and so on. And all of this discussion, I think there was an article that came out some years ago called Aleksandr Dugin, Queer Theorist, ? Because people read this chapter and they were like, what exactly is going on? He apparently wants to overcome the classical gender divisions, whether they're liberal, communist, or fascist. And his proposed solutions, which we'll talk about in a minute, are so suggestive and elusive that people were able to wonder all kinds of things about the meaning of this chapter. But for sure, the idea that you're going to be the white, rational European male of property who's, who cuts that figure, for Dugin, that is just too liberal in the classical sense, too modern, too outdated, and no longer defensible, no longer feasible, no longer desirable. But so too the communist and fascist alternatives.
Yeah, I can definitely understand looking at this, chapter, how it can easily be read that way. I mean, he starts out by immediately, like you said, separating biological sex and gender, talking about how these gender roles are only understood as valuable in that the man is the actor here. It's like you said, later on we'll get to some of his solutions that also kind of talk about destroying some of these distinctions, and it does in many ways sound like some aspects of modern gender theory if you're not looking very closely at them. So that context is certainly very important as we kind of move forward here.
Yeah, so just quickly I want to say one part of this argument, which we saw earlier versions of, and in the chapters we're still going to discuss, you see other versions of it. It's very clear that whenever he looks at postmodernity with its unique and specific characteristics, which he despises, and I'll leave it to your viewers and listeners to decide whether they also despise it, there's always the option of a return to the modern, like take one step back. Things are getting so crazy in postmodernity. Can't we just take one step back? Can't we go back to the good old days of the 80s and 90s, or of the Washington Consensus, or some can't we just take one step back? And it's never Dugin's view, and we have to wonder whether there's, whether he has any good reasons behind this, because obviously there are people today who do still prefer the one step back approach. But Dugin's view is that no, you had the march, there's a logic inherent in this movement. And the step from modernity to postmodernity, it brought us to some sort of abyss or precipice, but there's no turning back. There's somehow only going through, but you can go through in different ways. You can go through in the way of total dark night of the soul of postmodern dissolution, or you can go to some sort of other strange alternative, Dasein, the radical subject, Heidegger's other beginning, but you definitely can't just roll back the clock.
So a very interesting phrase here that I think a lot of people will probably raise an eyebrow at when they read this is he has a sentence that says, madness is part of the gender arsenal of the fourth political theory. What does he mean by that?
Okay, so this is a very good point and observation about the different ways you can go when you're beyond the modern models. And I'm going to say something about both about madness, but also about the sexes and also about this whole picture, because they're all related in a way. So Dugin does not mean we should all be completely insane, crazy, like on the street corner, attacking people just randomly out of the blue. That kind of deranged mental illness, the kind of insanity that follows, to anticipate the collapse of order, or a mind that has sort of become degenerated and decayed and crazy in that sense, that's not what he's talking about. But there's a kind of madness that is like Socrates once said, the greatest gift of the gods. There's a kind of madness which is a divine inspiration, which goes above mere human rationality or just above sort of mundane calculative concerns about what we need to do to stay efficient and well cared for and alive. There's a kind of madness that is Dionysian in the full, beautiful, poetic sense of the word. And that is what he has in mind. Mere rationality has cut us off from the roots of our deeper humanity. But somehow the madness that is Dionysian in the proper sense, and not just like the New York City public transit madness, is the kind of truly genuine, deep human and divine madness. So now on the Dionysian point, this is also very important. It's an idea he develops elsewhere, so I only want to just suggest something about it here. Dugin says, you can imagine three fundamental ways of interpreting the world. What she calls the Apollonian, the Dionysian, and the Cybelean. Cybele means the great mother. Cybele is there's a whole other story about Cybele, but Apollonian, Dionysian, and Cybelean. He says each of these three different ways of interpreting the world, they have their own construction of gender. So for example, in the Apollonian model, the woman has power and wisdom, kind of like Athena. Athena is a version of a goddess under the logos of Apollo. She has the characteristics of penetrating wisdom and power. But in the Dionysian world, gender is much more fluid and liminal, and the roles between the male and the female androgynous figure are much differently constituted. And finally, in the logos of the Great Mother, or in this third way of seeing the world, men become women by way of castration, primarily. So in later books, that's how he interprets our world. Our world is a world in which the men are being castrated and becoming swallowed by the black logos of the Great Mother. So all of this is to say, for him, and there are also these different kinds of madness, because take Apollo as an image of rationality. So as you go up and up and up the chain of rationality, as eventually you have this like beatific vision, or you have this ecstatic moment. And that ecstasy is for him a kind of madness. It's one step beyond our usual limits. So you get a sort of complicated model, much more complicated than just, man and woman. Well, we're talking about Apollonian, Dionysian, Cybelean. But that's sort of what he means. One other thing here too, because in the chapter, he admits that he's saying things that are very hard to understand. He says, for example, that he's explaining one unknown through another unknown when he says that gender in the fourth political theory is the same as sex in Dasein. That is, we have explained one unknown through another unknown. So he's changing the words, but they remain a puzzle. So one way I think that it's helpful just to begin to grasp what that might mean. So biologically, let's say it's very straightforward, okay, with 99.9% of the time, man and woman. And sociologically also 99.9% of the time, let's say it's pretty straightforward. But then you have a question. What if you believe man is primarily characterized not by his sexual organs and so on, but by his soul or by his intellect? And then you say, okay, are souls gendered? Well, now it's slightly more complicated. It's very clear somehow that bodies are gendered, that your biological existence has a sexual identity. That's sort of, straightforward. But if you believe that you're a spirit in a body, is your spirit also gendered in the same way? Like people don't typically think that the soul has sexual genitalia. So how do you start to think about the sexuality of the soul or the sexuality of the spirit? In this case, that's like a hint to why for Dugin the question of the sexuality of Dasein can also be open or strange. Because we have the whole problem of how does our bodily biological self interact with this other transcendent or spiritual dimension of ourselves. So that's sort of what he's trying to puzzle out.
Yeah, I'll say this, forgive me for doing this. It does sound a little Gnostic, right? But in this way that we need to separate, that these things aren't an interplay, and instead they need to be separated and understood without context to each other. But,
yeah. So again, I only suggest about the soul as so that you can get the sense of the problem or the question, because in Heidegger's philosophy, there's not, the body somehow, or the bodily self, is under-theorized in a way in Heidegger, but he's more interested in our relationship to being. But all I meant to point to was that kind of question. So not necessarily that we are body, soul, and spirit, and we have to figure out where does our, masculinity or femininity come from, but that if you consider the human being from some transcendental perspective or existential perspective, like Heidegger does, then it just becomes more complicated than if you're merely looking at, let's say, the other telling signs of sexuality and gender identity.
I gotcha. So, I also wanted to say really quickly, it's interesting that he brings this example up because he often he references Deleuze more than you would expect in this. Most people don't put a lot of tie a lot of postmodernism to Deleuze, and of course, Deleuze famous for a number of things, but particularly the fact that schizophrenia is it was what frees you from capitalism, keeps you it might make you the most able to kind of escape these things. So it's interesting that he does introduce madness here as kind of a factor, and he is bringing Deleuze into this very, very often. He does talk about the body of organ without organs. He does talk about the desiring machine, but he also rejects many of the things that Deleuze kind of comes to an end with. So he's pulling from some of this Marxist theory, he's pulling from some of this postmodernism, but he's not embracing all aspects of it here.
That's right, because any serious analyst of postmodernity or any serious postmodern thinker is saying something deeply true to some extent. And the question for Dugin is always, to what extent and how can we borrow profitably from their ideas? Another one is the fold. But he has other things in this chapter, he says, which again are mysterious, and you sort of have to puzzle through how literally he means them, what exactly he means to say by them. So he says that the subject of the fourth political theory is a non-adult male. So there's a reference there to the child, to immaturity, to the notion of play and playfulness, because there's a person related to Heidegger who wrote on the world as play. So there's always like what he says on the surface, and then all of the implied layers, that have reference to these other philosophers. And then sometimes we're sort of left just having to try to see, is this totally bogus? Is this halfway bogus? Or is this, not bogus at all? This chapter leaves a lot of open questions, obviously, but I would say that he's right. Gender does shift under these different ideologies. The gender models and roles and the ideal man and woman, the ideal type changes with the ideology. Okay, that seems fair enough to say. And so if you're trying to get outside of the ideologies, you're left with the question, what would be the new ideal type? And only other thing I want to add on this chapter that I think it's kind of clearer here than it is elsewhere, that not everybody who criticizes postmodernity and who criticizes the current state of post-liberalism goes into all of this existentialist Heideggerian side of things. So take, for example, again, my other key point of reference, Leo Strauss. His alternative was to have recourse to the notion of nature, human nature. The ideologies may tell you something different, but the underlying human nature doesn't change. All that changes is the way that the ideologies force you to interpret it, or the way they lie about it, or the way they try to push another version of it on you. But you can expel nature with a pitchfork, and nevertheless it returns. But in Dugin, that idea of a constant foundational nature is sort of absent. And it's absent in a way that it is from Heidegger as well, because the history of being and all of these other deep and strange philosophical questions dominate over top of the idea of a stable nature. So all of the weirdness around this discussion, I think, partly reflects that difference as well. Because you could say, well, look, the ancient Greek polis, it was neither liberal nor fascist nor communist, and it had its own version of men and women. Maybe there's a constant that lies underneath all of those changes. Dugin doesn't quite consider that here.
Yep. So, as you've hinted at a number of times here, of course, he goes into Dasein once again. And here he talks about Dasein as kind of being androgynous, and that it allows us to kind of move beyond the gender binary. Again, language that I think a lot of people will immediately say, okay, so here we go. The gender theory hitting hard. But he kind of explains that there's something to be reached when we're no longer looking at the opposites of these two, when we're no longer in the tension of these two, but instead the unity of those two genders. Could you go a little more into that?
Yeah, here's how I would put it. So in one of our previous discussions, in one of the previous chapters, he looked at the question of another binary, of another split, theory and practice. And he tried to understand, okay, how are we going to make fourth political theory practical? And if you remember, he said postmodernity overcomes that division, but it overcomes it by blurring it horizontally. The fourth political theory overcomes that division by digging to the root, the common root. And in some sense, I think a similar logic applies to his analysis of gender. So postmodernity may start to blur the gender boundaries, but it does so sort of horizontally. I like to think, this is just, I'm sure other people have written about this, but I find it helpful that like postmodernity has closed off the possibilities of self-transcendence. And instead the transcendence is like you become sexually trans, you move horizontally from one thing to another, or you're in that sort of murky horizontal mixed ground. But Dugin says, yes, we need to overcome the binary. At least we need to think about what it would mean to overcome it. But we have to do that by going not just in the middle and not just, adding them together so that it's a big, mix of things that were already there in the first place. But you need to try to penetrate to the origin of the division. And obviously he doesn't mean the biological origin of the division. He really is always primarily concerned with the conceptual or the existential dimension of this split. So it is interesting that when Heidegger analyzes the nature of human existence, he doesn't talk about it's almost like it applies equally to men and women in his analysis or presentation. It's not linked to or indexed to being a man or being a woman. And therefore it sort of is that kind of open question. So it's always that idea of, can we go deeper down than the division and then come back up instead of some sort of mechanical operation of adding them or combining them.
Gotcha. And then he goes ahead and talks about kind of how there are three different approaches to kind of attempting to understand this problem of political gender. He talks about how postmodernism is a maximization of kind of the liberal man. It's kind of taking it to its extremes. He looks at Marxism and what he describes as the sexless cyborg. And then he talks about how conservatism attempts to basically kind of reassert masculinity, bring us back to continuing modernity by reasserting that classical understanding of masculinity.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, those are some of the options we have. Probably all three of them are operating simultaneously. Sexless cyborgs, that's not so far-fetched. AI and robot technologies are getting to be pretty good. And these sex chatbots and so on, from what I see on the Twitter timeline. So that kind of androgynous sex with robots or whatever, it's probably, maybe people are already doing it as we speak for all I know. So these are all potentialities. And it's very important for him that the conservative response, as he puts it, when conservative forces stand up for this archetype, demand the return of masculinity, they thereby only try to continue modernity through these gender reconstructions. The position seems hopeless. And here again, the fourth political theory, in our opinion, goes forward. So I would say this, what's good about this chapter and what's good about Dugin's position here, whether we buy into part of it or all of it or none of it, is that at least it's clearly carving something out. The reassertion of traditional masculinity, or of 80s, 90s, or 50s, 60s masculinity or whatever, right? It's carving out a clear position and he is saying, no, that's not viable. That's not gonna, you can't roll with that, There's more happening than meets the eye, and we can't respond to it just like that.
Yeah, he is not ignoring this issue, which I think a lot of people would just like it to go away. So I think
and if you consider, the Russian version of the book was written in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure that I'm not. And he mentions here, all of the transgenderism and all these things that maybe then were less a matter of everyday conversation. Now we're inundated with these themes and topics. And for him, they were pretty self-evident trends even then, which I think says something about how he's analyzing postmodernity.
Yeah, I think that's right. Whenever somebody makes at least a solidly predictive statement, you want to make sure you understand kind of some of the logic behind it. There's probably some value to it. All right, so our next chapter is 14, and this is the final official chapter of the book. It's against the postmodern world. Now, in a lot of ways, I felt like this is pretty much kind of a restated chapter where we're going over a lot of the ideas and summing them up. There's still some, I think, important things to hit here, but he is tying up some of those loose threads. So it's called Against the Postmodern World. And the very first thing he kind of steps back into again is unipolarity versus multipolarity. And he specifically says a line here, which is very bombastic, which people will want to hear. America is the center of the kingdom of the Antichrist. So it's not pulling too many punches here, but I guess we can kind of touch again on his understanding of multipolarity versus unipolarity, and how the only way the only way out is through, then the American empire, kind of as it stands, the global American empire, can't continue in its current form.
Yeah, I think you could say for him, the America under the rule of the Democratic Party is the kingdom of the Antichrist, because he did support Trump. And in this other book that he put out not too long ago, The Great Reset versus the Great Reawakening, or the other way around, he says that Trump threw a wrench into the whole system of unipolarity and of the Great Reset and of the forces of the destruction of the essence of the human being and so on. So he's not against everything happening in the United States. He's against what the United States is when it is run by Clinton, Biden, the Democratic Party, and so on. That's a big part of it. But it's also worth noting, in my opinion, restating, because we said something like it earlier, that even within America and within the West, there are defenders of the pre-modern West, or let's say of the genuine, true roots of American identity. And it's really this hostile takeover of the West and the hostile takeover of America that, in my view anyway, he's primarily against. So anybody who has that spirit of unipolarity in them would be representing the bad guys from his point of view. But anybody who has the spirit of tradition in them, whether they're inside America or outside of it, would be part of the good guys. And therefore, he talks about the anti-globalist and anti-imperialist front, and this kind of alliance among the different religions, among the different factions, among the different states and civilizations and peoples, because there's a common enemy in his view, the common enemy, unipolarity, and its acolytes. So for what it's worth, I mean, I think there are parts of this chapter, of this particular part of the chapter, that are important, where he says Muslims shouldn't fight Christians, Christians shouldn't fight Jews. Don't make this a religious holy war, because in fact, when you defend tradition, you're defending somehow the right of each of those other players to have its place in the world. So the common enemy is the one who wants to wipe out the possibility of a tradition, custom, a faith, and so on. So that and some other things are new, but yeah, I mean, he does say those things against the United States, but in my opinion, they apply with those caveats.
Yeah, he does, as he did previously when he used this kind of language, does specifically say there are people inside the United States who stand against this. They will be essential to kind of opposing this. And so he does give that caveat, to be fair. And yeah, it does kind of, like you said, he frames this as you need to have all people of tradition, all people who would oppose kind of this current ruling order, to stop squabbling and move together as one. You do kind of get the feeling of the Lawrence of Arabia, where all the tribes need to be united to fight against the force that would otherwise kind of collapse their different traditions, but they seem unable to actually work together, and so they are divided and destroyed individually. And so you do get that feeling from him here.
I will say, I started working on Dugin in 2011. That's when I began translating this book. And since then, I've had a lot of students and professors and people, talk to me about Dugin and his ideas. And yeah, I do get the sense, because some of them have been religious Jews, some of them have been Muslims, some of them have been Christians. Some of them are traditionalists of another sort or stripe. Some of them just are American patriots who don't like what's happening with the current American regime and so on. And everybody has found something valuable in his analysis, even if they don't share it all the way. So I think reading him, you do get the sense he's trying to make sure that he says those things that unite, for the most part, the right groups against the wrong groups, the wrong group being, again, the party of unipolarity and so on, without, at least now, I don't say this is true of everything he's ever written, but without trying to introduce all kinds of new divisions or new schisms or new factions. Because the whole idea, if you remember from earlier in the book, he says it's not just enough to have a great ideology, and it's not just enough to have a lot of political power. Because if you have a strong state with no great idea, or a great idea with no power behind it, you're not actually going to be able effectively to oppose unipolarity. So part of his rhetoric, or part of his art of writing, part of the way that he presents his ideas, is designed to be able to fashion a consensus among groups that may otherwise not have one. So maybe, how much of that is strategic, rhetorical, viable, and so on, but it's for sure it's a part of his project.
Yeah, I think that is one of the more interesting parts of this book for me, because many people are, willing to say I'm against globalism, I'm against kind of this new world order, I'm against this attempt to unify and liquefy nations into kind of this one global hegemon, but they don't really think about what that would take and what that would entail. And the fact that he stops to remind people, like, the only thing that's going to most people ignore the problem of the centralization of power. They just say, I'm against globalism, but they ignore the fact that a unified global power is going to be stronger than whatever divided nationalism they might embrace. And so the fact that he understands that, and he says, okay, there is a way to unify these things, there is a way to kind of form an opposing position where everyone does not have to agree on the same culture, the exact same tradition, the exact same way of life, but does agree that the existence of those cultural and moral particulars is valuable. It is important. I think it's a detail that's too often brushed over by those that oppose globalism, but don't think critically about what would actually take to kind of unify and push back against it.
Yeah, absolutely. And parts of it may still strike people as unsettling or uncomfortable or unfamiliar, because he says, there should be cooperation between the left and the right. You could combine the ecologists and the orthodox traditionalists. And, so we have to it's in this sense, it's a big anti-liberal or big anti-modern tent, because you may have people on the, like he puts it here, conscious cooperation of the radical left-wingers and the new right, as well as with religious and other anti-modern movements, such as the ecologists and green theorists, for example. So, normally, let's say you might look at the green theorists and think that they're completely whatever, right? And they may look to the right and think that those people are completely crazy. So the prejudices have to be put aside. And I think a memorable passage from this chapter, along a couple of other things that are worth discussing, where he says that these little group divisions, the hostility of one group to another group, these prejudices are the instruments in the hands of liberals and globalists with which they keep their enemies divided. So we should strongly reject anti-communism as well as anti-fascism. Both of them are counter-revolutionary tools in the hands of the global liberal elite. Very interesting, because on one hand, he's rejected communism and fascism. So he's not for communism, he's not for fascism, but he's also not for anti-communism, and he's not for anti-fascism, because those movements can be exploited by the central power for the sake of opposing any possible genuine alternative, which is just also intriguing. And I don't think you see that kind of argument necessarily every time you read a criticism of contemporary postmodernism.
No, I thought that was very interesting because, for instance, Paul Gottfried has written a whole book about how the American kind of global order is inherently a program of denazification, anti-fascist, and it's in its construction, and that it kind of blinds it to kind of all of its other problems, or all the ways that anything might be opposed to it. So I do think that's interesting that he picked up on that strain of thought there. But I also wanted to point out that he encourages the opposition here to be anti-capitalist, anti-liberal, anti-cosmopolitan, and anti-individualist. Again, a lot of people might kind of pull back from any one of those assertions, but it is obvious that these are elements that are essential to kind of the current world order. And so if you're looking at something that's beyond it, you are probably going to have to oppose all of these things in at least some way.
Yeah, so I haven't read it, but one of his recent books is called Anti-Capitalism from the Right. So it's clearly a part of his attack on the modern world is a critical assessment of capitalism that he can borrow in part from the leftist tradition, but reinterpret it from a traditionalist, let's say, or right-wing perspective. Obviously, people who are all in on the social and political virtues of capitalism won't like that. But even so, you learn from people who have criticized your position, and therefore it's worth considering. One thing I want to say about an earlier page in this chapter, just because I think it's helpful. So way back near the beginning of the book, when he started talking about towards the fourth political theory, the subject of the fourth political theory, and he said it's going to reject the individual, the class, the race, and the state. It's going to posit something else. One thing he said then was, as we look for possible key players of the fourth political theory, ultimately hits upon Dasein. But as we look at it, we can see like combinations. So for example, maybe you combine like National Bolshevism. You've combined the class concern of communism with the ethnic or state concern of fascism or something like that. So some people who have written about this book are like, yeah, all Dugin's trying to do is to combine the other political theories. But here he says, in my opinion, this is important for understanding him. He says this idea of a combination, I'm not quoting yet, I'll be quoting in a second. The idea of combining the first, second, and third political theory, he says, is only the first step. The mechanical addition of deeply revised versions of the anti-liberal ideologies of the past, in other words, combining some sort of red-brown alliance, will not give us a final result. It's only a first approximation and preliminary approach. So it's kind of like just the first mental exercise to get you outside of the usual way of thinking. But then, as he puts it, we must go further and make an appeal to tradition and pre-modern sources of inspiration. So you're not going to fight liberalism effectively just by combining nationalism and socialism. Rather, you have to have recourse to Plato, to medieval philosophy, to theology, and to all of these deeper, somehow more serious sources. And therefore, he also puts it, he's not telling us what the theory is and what it's not. It's a kind of invitation and appeal rather than a dogma. So I've always thought that was pretty important as well, both because he's saying there's this preliminary step, like an operation to get us warmed up. Then there's a much bigger task, and everybody's invited to participate in that task, to develop it, to think it through, And what he's really doing is just setting some initial parameters.
Yeah, that covers most of the rest of what I was going to say there. I think he touches once again on the synthesis of communism and fascism, talking about how you need to discard the materialism of communism, you need to discard the race obsession of fascism, and you need to kind of take what else is still left between those two. But as you said, that he then talks a lot about National Bolshevism there. I don't know if you want to touch on any more of that. We mentioned National Bolshevism before and why that might be important to him. I don't think we went into a lot of detail of what it is and kind of how that might connect to the fourth political theory.
Yeah, so I'll just say one thing about National Bolshevism, which is Dugin had been involved with this ideological experiment earlier in his career, and it had a political dimension because he was one of the co-founders of the National Bolshevik Party. There's an essay online of his you can find called The Metaphysics of National Bolshevism, which is interesting and worth reading. And what I really like about that essay, as a clear conceptual distinction, he says, there's this book by Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies. So he says, I'm going to define National Bolshevism as the enemies of the open society. Yeah. So on one hand, you have, and that's how he defines it at first in that essay. So that gives you some sense of where he was going with it before the concept developed further. And then I have to say, there are all of these minor details, that point to other arguments in Dugin's work. And there's a very important one at the end of this chapter. So remember, he's against unipolarity geopolitically, ideologically, and spiritually. He defends multipolarity, but he makes this point at the end. He says, multipolarity in all senses can be helpful. And quoting, the important concept of nous, intellect, developed by the Greek philosopher Plotinus, corresponds to our ideal. The intellect is one and multiple at the same time because it has multiple differences in itself. And then he says the future world should be noetic in some way. Now, I'm going to make one little comment about this. So he's combined multipolarity, which people might normally think of as just geopolitical, with the idea of nous, a purely philosophical concept. And he has a series of books, I think there's 24 of them in total, called noomachia. The noo part of that is nous, and the machia part means like war. So wars of nous. And it's his philosophical analysis of civilizational multipolarity. So here he says it in a paragraph. Multipolarity must be noetic. Well, what does that mean? Well, he's got 24 volumes on the analysis of civilizational multipolarity based on nous. So in my school, I have a course on the introductory volumes just to get people acquainted before he goes into like civilization by civilization analysis. But it's just another kind of Dugin move, Multipolarity, everybody gets it. Oh, that means that, BRICS is going to be something, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization is going to be something, and Saudi Arabia is getting strong. But that doesn't tell you what he means when he says it must be noetic in some way, and that's where the philosophy comes in.
See, I thought like the 4 volumes of Society and the Mind were a little excessive, but I guess, I should be grateful I didn't have to go through 24 volumes of it. All right.
Yeah. He said in one of his interviews, he says these 24 volumes, they should really just serve as like a table of contents for the real work. So,
sure.
He really wants a rich account of civilizational multipolarity, but, 24 volumes is already a lot.
It feels like a decent amount, yeah. All right, so then we get to our appendices here, and there's two of them. The first one is kind of a sum up of terms that are used in the writing here. He goes through political post-anthropology, political post-humanity, and the post-state, the political soldier in the simulacrum, and the alternative in political post-human anthropology, pre-human, and PC here. Some of these are just, again, restatements of ideas we've already gotten through in the book, but is there any of this that you want to stop and focus on for a minute?
Yeah, so I'll say, just like in the case of gender, there was the question, can you return to a standard classical masculine ideal or something like that? So too here, he says, in the postmodern state of affairs, can you just return to the figure of the political soldier, someone who's willing to fight and die for his idea? That's a modern, in his view anyway, there were political soldiers, but in our virtual postmodern state, it would be like a self-parodying weird simulacrum type thing, like there's no longer a space in the world for genuine political soldier. That would be another example of taking a step back. So that's why I said, in the logic of gender, in the logic of the ideologies, and here in the logic of the figure of the political man, there's no taking a step back. So I think that's a helpful idea. And then there's some things he says that, again, I don't know, there are references to Deleuze for sure, but also where he says, now how fashion, celebrity, glamour, show business, they're inculcating ideas that to attain material prosperity, one doesn't need to earn money through work. One must instead be recognized by the relevant social set, become a member of the ever-changing glamour network. All of these things, I think, again, trends that he identified there that have continued and gotten even crazier. Actual work is not necessary. It's optional. That made me think of all those TikTok videos of like a day in the work of a Google employee where they're just sitting around looking pretty or whatever. That's, the post state in a nutshell. And then he has other just nice phrases like it's a sort of pirate republic placed in cyberspace or a Brazilian carnival, a hallucinatory game. So somehow, it's all related to the things he said before in this sort of unreal virtual parody, confused parody of the earlier states of relative normality, but we also just can't return there.
All right. So the next appendices is an interesting one. I don't know what the context came in for this, if it was a separate chapter. I know you helped to translate this, so maybe you know better how this kind of ended up where it did, but it's called The Metaphysics of Chaos.
Yeah, so I didn't translate this chapter, and I'm not, I wasn't involved with the compilation of the text, so it combined some of the original chapters of Fourth Political Theory with some other ones. But I will say this, chaos is a very important theme for Dugin. Some people who have skimmed the surface of his public profile have said, there's this star, the star that's in the middle of the cover right here. They're like, that's the chaos star. And that proves that Dugin is a Satanist because he follows Aleister Crowley and he's like chaos. I've heard, you can read all kinds of things about the meaning of that star and so on, the chaos star. But the idea of chaos is actually very important in his work, not only here in this appendix. In his second Heidegger book called Martin Heidegger, The Possibility of Russian Philosophy, he has a whole section on the meaning of a philosophy of chaos. I translated parts of it, and they're available in my book, on my second book, which is called Inside Putin's Brain, The Political Philosophy of Aleksandr Dugin. If anybody wants, they can reach out and I'll send a free PDF copy or whatever. You don't have to buy it. But it has excerpts of his philosophy of chaos from that book. Another thing I want to say is there's a very nice essay of his available online, which is he goes over like the original meanings of chaos in the Greek philosophers, Empedocles and so on. And there's a lot about this topic that's very, very, very important. So in this chapter, you start to get a sense of it, not the last word. Like much of this book is like that, suggestive, but not the last word, but still a lot, and here the idea, this is the crucial idea, is that there is not one chaos, there are two chaoses. There's a chaos that follows the collapse of order, and there's a chaos that precedes, as it were, the birth of order. And that little division, like so many other little divisions in this book, help Dugin to analyze the state of affairs. So if logos or reason or rationality has played itself out to this post-rational, schizophrenic, postmodern world, playground or nightmare or carnival, depending on how you prefer to see it. So it's going into a chaos. It's becoming chaotic. And that chaos is reflected in all kinds of processes, in new technologies, and the development of chaos, the mathematics that's appropriate to the study of chaos. But it is all the collapse, a collapse of logos, collapse of reason, dissolution, dissipation, and somehow destruction. But a destruction that's interpreted as progressive, as better. And Dugin, when he puzzles through philosophically all of these challenges, what do we need a new philosophy, or are we just left with what we have now? What are we going to do? He goes all the way back to the beginning, as it were, and says, what about the original chaos? What about the womb of order? What about that which embraced logos but wasn't logos? And it's, again, some people might hear that and be like, this is totally abstract, this is totally useless, it doesn't solve any real problems. But it doesn't matter, because whenever we think about things like rights or the state or authority, legitimacy, we're always going to be thinking quote unquote abstractly, but in ways that do have a lot of relevance. So in the Heidegger book that I mentioned, he says, when he goes through the philosophy of chaos, he's like, from this perspective, we have to reinterpret the whole meaning of Russian history and of world history and so on. So absolutely crucial concept. And not to go on and on, but I want to say one more thing, which isn't in the chapter, but which may help people to think about it. The natural opposition is between chaos and order. Like people who read Jordan Peterson or whatever else, may be familiar with that kind of opposition. So if the natural, in this chapter, he talks about chaos and logos, but another natural opposition to chaos and order. So when we think about international affairs, when we think politically, usually we think in terms of order. New world order, as you mentioned earlier, a fight for the global order, a multipolar world order. And one of the things that Dugin tries to bring out is that it's not just a new order that's at stake. It's not just the nature of order in the world that's at stake right now. It's also the nature of chaos that's at stake. And chaos is related to the processes around these wars, because war is chaotic. So it's a huge theme for him, way beyond this chapter. But as I say, this chapter is like a good first exposure to it.
Yeah, I think that hit most of the notes I had on there. He was just talking about how logos was kind of the end of European philosophy, kind of the two chaoses, the distinction that you had talked about there. That's important, that I wanted to hit on. Logos as the center of a number of religions, especially Christianity and Greek thought. And so, yeah, I think that pretty much hits everything. Conservatism as kind of the restoration of logos. That might be interesting to talk about for just a second. I see a lot of people, Jordan Peterson, others, especially on kind of the non-woke left, or the kind of the classical centrist or classical liberal kind of centrist movement, talking about logos as a way to kind of revivify the Western tradition and bring things back. He kind of he predicts this, right? He predicts that this is the route that conservatives will take, attempting to kind of rehabilitate logos and bring it back into the kind of the center of the discussion. But every time I hear people talk about this, it's always feels like them trying to do a disembodied rationalist version of Christianity. It always feels like them trying to find kind of the remnants of Christian ethos and kind of tie it together in a way that will become acceptable for people who are no longer able to be bound by kind of a religious ideal. And I think that might be kind of part of what he's pointing at when he's talking about the kind of these attempts will fail, and it has to kind of move beyond that. But I didn't know if you wanted to expound a little bit on that at all.
So there would be, in my view, different ways you could try to return to logos. Some of them would be a reassertion of a specific kind of rationality. Some of them may be an attempt to restore classical learning. Let's go back and can't we all just go memorize Dante like we used to, or something like that? The classical school model. Others may be a kind of watered down Christianity, or a very Jungified. So there are all of these possible ways that you could do it. But Dugin, again, following the logic that you can't take a step back unless you go back to the very origin, or the very source. That is always the sort of movement of his thought here. And one of the things that I've observed, a lot of the, slightly different from the point you made, but I've observed that a lot of, let's say, conservatives, Republicans, or defenders of tradition, anti-postmodern thinkers, they want to go back to let's learn Greek again and Latin again, and really let's do this sort of like encyclopedia of the cultural treasures of the Western world. In other words, the whole positive history of logos. But one of the things that Dugin is so adamant about is that in some way, the postmoderns are right that you have to go to Nietzsche, you have to go to Heidegger, you have to go to those people who saw the end of logos, or at least who claimed to have seen the end of it, who claimed to have seen its total loss of power and legitimacy, and who were able to analyze that process in a lot of detail. So it's kind of like, again, this is the way that I see things. I think it maps on somehow. German philosophers who, especially Heidegger, but not only, who looked over the whole process of Western philosophy, they were read by the left postmoderns and not so much by the conservative rightists. And therefore, the combination of a desire to go back to the very origin of the whole drama of reason, of logos, the whole problem of being and non-being in some sense, the whole problem of chaos and order, to go all the way back to the origin of that problem, the conservative, Republican, somehow classically oriented right would have to go where it doesn't want to go, into German philosophy. And that's why Dugin represents a very unique alternative. He's combined that concern with German philosophy, but in a way that is unfamiliar, because we tend to see that among the French postmodern leftists, not among the Russian postmodern rightists, as it were. But that's a key and crucial problem, because even though it would be good, let's say everybody at the table could agree, it would be much better for people to read the Bible and Shakespeare and Plato and Cicero and all of these other great works, like you can get from a St. John's curriculum or something like that. That would be much better than if they constantly read some sort of contemporary ideological trash. That's probably true. They would become more cultivated, more cultured. They'd have more points of reference, and they would understand the whole heritage and the legacy of the Western world in a way that right now is under attack. That's true. But will they have penetrated to the deepest dimension of the most fundamental problems? That remains open. And that's where Dugin, in his constant reference to Heidegger, is always looking to go. So that's sort of where matters stand, I would say, with the question of chaos. That's what it represents to him. It represents the very source and origin of the tradition.
All right. Well, we can go ahead and probably wrap up here. Before we go to the questions of the people, first, is there anything that we've gone through 5 episodes here, but is there anything that we didn't get to, something that we didn't explore in enough depth, or something that we need to touch on again that you can think about?
No, I think we did a good job. All credit to you for covering the book cover to cover. I'll just say, for those who are intrigued enough to want to read more, there's definitely more to read. So there's The Rise of the Fourth Political Theory, which is part 2. There are all of these other books that we referred to of Dugin's, Ethnos and Society, beginning with Heidegger, my book on him. And this, there's a lot that you can read if you want to keep studying Dugin. But this was a great place to start, and for many people, a great place to finish too, because it does give you a nice round overview, I think, of his major concerns.
And let me encourage people. I know Michael was graciously like, you don't have to buy my book, I'll hand you a copy or whatever, but do buy Michael's book. He's put in the yeoman's work here. He's giving you a master class on understanding this book. Throw the man some help here. You got to support people who are doing great work. So make sure that you're taking care of those who are putting in the hours like Michael is, because I think it's really important. But that said, Michael, where can people find your work if they want to support you, want to look into what you're doing?
So I'm on Twitter, M_Millerman. I have a school, millermanschool.com, some paid courses, some free courses. I'm on YouTube, where I put out lectures on Heidegger, Strauss, Dugin, and other figures. And you can find some of my books, my 2 books, on Amazon. And so just, I'm putting out material on political philosophy and political theory wherever I can. Millerman School is my main site.
Excellent. And guys, I've really enjoyed this series. I've gotten really good feedback from this. I'm thinking about doing, streams like this as kind of a regular feature. So if there is a work, if there's a thinker, if somebody that you'd like to have a deep dive in, kind of a multi-part series looking at a particular work, let me know. Put those comments down in the description, and I'll take those under advisement as I kind of plan out going forward what we're going to be looking at. That said, we do have a super chat here, so let me grab it here. Cripper Weirdo here for $5. How do we know this isn't another attempt at enlightened centrism? So yeah, there's a lot of synthesis here, right? There's a lot of, well, we take a little bit of this and we take a little bit of that, and we pull it all together. I think there's a couple obvious answers here, but how do we know that Dugin isn't just pulling a little bit of enlightened centrism, but just kind of his geopolitical interests?
Well, I would say that one way to think about centrism is a kind of moderation. We don't want to go to the extremes. We sort of want to, you don't want to upset the people on the right too much. You don't want to upset the people on the left too much. Let's find this sort of moderate, happy middle ground. That's not Dugin's view. He's a much more radical thinker. One of the biggest criticisms against him, I think, is how little moderation matters to him, how extreme he is in wanting to go all the way to the beginning or all the way to the end, or, very much against this or against that. So, a centrism would be more a matter of playing it safe. Here, this is much more revolutionary. It's just not leftist revolutionary. It's a different kind of conservative revolutionary thought. So I think that would be one way to distinguish it. And then also with its interests in mysticism and in madness and in chaos, I think that it goes against the grain of what we would normally consider enlightened, which is sort of like purely rational and less mystical and less mad and less chaotic.
Yeah, I think that your point of, normally you would be trying not to offend anyone, and instead Dugin seems to offend everyone, is probably a sign that he's not just aiming for the broadest audience. So I think that's a safe bet. Also, I noticed a number of people bringing up the chaos symbol. Yes, guys, I also recognize that symbol from Warhammer 40K. So yeah, that's where I knew the chaos symbol from. I knew it immediately. So I hear you. All right, guys, I think that's everything. Once again, thank you to Michael for coming on. Did a great job, laid it out in a very helpful way. I know I learned a ton. I got lots of good feedback from other people who learned a lot. So excellent that we were able to go through this. I think it'll be very helpful. Again, guys, just want to remind you, these are not endorsements of ideas. This is not embracing of all of these things. We're looking at a thinker because we want to better understand where they're coming from, the different sources they're pulling together, the thought they're exploring. You don't have to embrace all of this stuff or even any of it to still find value in the points that he's bringing forward, the analysis that he's bringing forward. As I pointed out many times, Dugin is often pulling from a lot of different people. A lot of these thoughts aren't new to him, but he's bringing them together in a very interesting way. And there's a lot of value in that. So even if you don't find one thing that Dugin said particularly helpful, remember he's drawing from lots of other thinkers that you can explore as well to kind of better understand those different pieces of the puzzle that he's pulling together. As always, guys, if this is your first time here, please make sure that you go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And if you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, make sure you subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on all your favorite podcast networks. Thanks for coming by, guys. And as always, we'll talk to you next time.